It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the phone call came. For most families, a Tuesday morning is a simple passage of time, a prelude to the week's responsibilities, routine meetings, and quiet moments. But for Sarah and her husband David, it was the moment that everything changed. The hum of their everyday life was disrupted by an unexpected visitor. Karen, the well-known and domineering president of their community's homeowners association, HOA. Sarah had never been fond of Karen, but she knew how it worked. The HOA had a strange hold over their neighborhood, enforcing rules with an iron fist. From regulating the color of fences to approving lawn decorations, it was a constant reminder of the small-town drama that could quickly escalate into chaos. Most neighbors avoided confrontation, and Sarah had always done her best to keep a low profile. The last thing they needed was more trouble, especially considering the challenges they faced with their daughter, Emma. Emma, their precious 7-year-old, had been born with a severe disability. Her life was a delicate balance of medical treatments, therapies, and care routines. She had been in and out of hospitals since birth, battling complications that left her dependent on a life support machine to regulate her breathing. It wasn't easy. Every day brought its own set of challenges. But Sarah and David had adjusted, learning to care for Emma with love and patience. They never let her condition define her. Emma had a bright smile and a sparkle in her eyes that made the world around her seem almost magical, even in the face of adversity. That morning, as Sarah was feeding Emma her breakfast, the doorbell rang. It was a crisp, firm sound, a sound that didn't belong to the usual pattern of neighbors dropping by for casual chats or friends bringing over food. Sarah looked at the clock. It wasn't even 9:30 a.m. When she opened the door, she was greeted by Karen's icy smile. "Sarah," Karen greeted her, her voice clipped with the authority she always carried. "We need to talk about the equipment you're using." Sarah froze. She knew exactly what this was about. Her life support machine for Emma. It wasn't the first time the HOA had come knocking on their door, but this was different. "What about it?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Karen didn't waste any time. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the concrete, eyes narrowing with the kind of self-assuredness that made most people hesitate. "You're in violation of the HOA's new rules," she said, as if delivering an unassailable truth. "You've installed medical equipment on your property without proper approval. I've received several complaints from your neighbors." Sarah's heart sank. The thought that their neighbors could be complaining about Emma's life-saving equipment was devastating. They had always been discreet, trying their best not to make waves, but now it felt as though their whole world was about to unravel. "Karen, this equipment is a medical necessity. You know that. We've done everything by the book. There's nothing for you to worry about." But Karen wasn't hearing any of it. Her eyes glinted with a strange mix of superiority and contempt. "The rules are the rules, Sarah. You're breaking them. I don't care what your medical needs are. There are regulations in place for a reason. If you don't remove that equipment, I will have no choice but to take further action. I will be filing a formal complaint with the HOA, and you could face penalties or worse." Sarah's face flushed with disbelief. "You're threatening to take action against a little girl who is fighting for her life?" Her voice broke, the emotion swelling in her chest. "This isn't a rule issue, Karen. This is my daughter's life." But Karen was unmoved. "That's irrelevant. It's not about the child. It's about the rules." She paused, her lips curling into a tight, cold smile. "If you don't comply, I will have no choice but to involve the board, and trust me, the HOA takes violations very seriously." Sarah wanted to scream, to throw Karen off her property and tell her that she didn't understand anything about real life, about the sacrifices and struggles they faced every day. But the words got stuck in her throat. What could she do? What power did she have in this moment? She knew she couldn't let Emma's medical equipment go, but could she stand against the full force of the HOA, the community, that by all accounts should have been on her side. As Karen turned to leave, she cast one last cold glance over her shoulder. "You have 48 hours to remove the equipment, or I will have to escalate this. Don't think you're above the rules, Sarah." Sarah stood frozen at the door, her heart racing. She felt a tight knot of panic form in her stomach. She was being forced into a corner she never thought she'd find herself in. She hadn't anticipated this kind of attack. She needed time to think, to strategize. But how could she focus when her daughter's life hung in the balance? How could she find peace when the very people around her were attacking what mattered most? David was away on a business trip, and Sarah knew that breaking this news to him would only add more stress to an already overwhelming situation. She couldn't imagine how he would feel, especially when he had been working tirelessly to secure their daughter's future. But this wasn't a problem she could handle alone. She needed help, and she needed it fast. Sarah paced the living room, glancing nervously at Emma, who was lying in her bed, blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding around her. Emma was asleep, her breathing steady through the mechanical hum of the life support. Every time Sarah looked at her, she was reminded of how fragile life was, how thin the line between health and crisis could be. She knew the stakes. If the HOA forced them to remove Emma's life support, the consequences would be catastrophic. Emma couldn't breathe without it. It wasn't just a violation of some HOA rule, it was a death sentence. With shaking hands, Sarah reached for her phone. She needed someone who could offer guidance, someone who could help her fight back against this madness. She needed a plan. But most of all, she needed to protect Emma. David sat in his office, the hum of the quiet air conditioning punctuating the otherwise still afternoon. He had been glued to his laptop for hours, going over an endless stream of emails, proposals, and client calls. The life of a military general, especially one who had seen his fair share of high-stakes missions, was not supposed to feel this mundane. But for David, who had spent most of his career in the shadows of high command, it was all he had ever known. The stillness of civilian life suited him well. He had retired from active duty some years ago, opting for a quieter existence in the suburban neighborhood where his family lived, where no one knew the full extent of his past. His phone buzzed, on the desk, breaking his concentration. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. Sarah. There was something in her tone earlier when they had spoken that told him something wasn't right. The worry in her voice was palpable, and, though he had tried to calm her down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big. He hit the answer button immediately, his instincts kicking in. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with concern. "What's going on?" The moment Sarah spoke, David could hear the emotion crack through her words. "David, it's Karen. She's threatening us again. This time, it's about Emma's equipment. She's given us 48 hours to remove it, or she's going to escalate this to the HOA board. I don't know what to do. I'm at a breaking point." David sat up straighter, his military mind already shifting gears. The issue wasn't about the equipment. It wasn't about the rules Karen was spouting. No, this was personal. This was about Sarah, his family, and a woman who had clearly crossed a line she shouldn't have. He took a deep breath, his mind running through various strategies, but nothing felt right. He had long kept his identity hidden from most people in the neighborhood, preferring to blend into civilian life. His history in the military wasn't something he paraded around. It was a part of him that had stayed buried for years. But now, it seemed like that very part of him might be the key to taking down someone like Karen. "I'll be home as soon as I can," David said, his tone firm. "We'll take care of this. You've done nothing wrong. We're not going to let her get away with this." When he arrived home, the house felt strangely tense. He walked in to find Sarah pacing in the living room, her brow furrowed in deep thought. Emma, lying peacefully on her bed, was oblivious to the storm that was brewing just outside her door. David didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked straight to Sarah, pulling her into an embrace. It was a silent moment of reassurance, of reminding her that they were a team, no matter what. "We need to do something," Sarah said, pulling back to look at him. "She's going to push this, David, I know it. She won't stop until she gets her way." David could see the exhaustion in her eyes. He had always admired her strength, how she balanced caring for Emma with everything else in their life. But now it was his turn to take charge. He knew what he had to do. "You're right," David said, his voice steady. "We're going to make sure she knows exactly who she's dealing with. Karen won't be able to hide behind her authority anymore. She won't be able to hurt us." Sarah looked at him, confused but also desperate for any solution. "What are you saying, David?" David smiled, though it was a tight, resolute one. "I'm not a civilian, Sarah. I'm a general, and I've spent my life studying strategy, analyzing people, and executing precision. It's time I stop hiding who I am." Sarah's eyes widened in realization. She had known about his past. Of course she did. But it had never felt as real to her as it did in that moment. David had kept his military background quiet, not wanting to draw attention or complicate their lives. But now, it was the key to dismantling Karen's misguided sense of control. If Karen was going to play dirty, David was going to play smarter. That evening, David made a plan. A strategy, one honed from years of military experience, designed to outmaneuver Karen and her HOA cronies. His first step was simple. He would need to expose the extent of Karen's overreach. No one had the right to bully his family, especially not someone who had no understanding of what it meant to fight for something truly important. He knew that to make an impact, he would need to hit Karen where it hurt. Her pride, her reputation, and most importantly, her position within the HOA. The next morning, David dressed in a crisp professional suit, something he hadn't worn in years. As he buttoned up his shirt, he could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had spent years working hard to step away from the military, to leave the high-stakes world behind. But sometimes, the world doesn't let. You leave so easily. Sometimes you're called back into the fray, not because you want to, but because there's no other choice. David drove to the HOA office, his mind sharp and focused. It wasn't about the equipment. It wasn't about the rules. It was about the principle that Karen had crossed, a principle he'd sworn to protect his entire life. He walked into the building with the confidence of a man who had seen the worst the world could throw at him and come out on top. Inside, Karen sat behind her desk, the air around her stiff with authority. Her eyes narrowed when she saw David approach. She had no idea who he was or what he was capable of. She was about to find out. "Karen," David said, his voice cold and commanding. "I'm General David Harper, and I've been following your little campaign against my family. I think it's time we have a conversation about your behavior." Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. David didn't give her a chance to speak. He continued, "I've spent my life serving this country, Karen. I've led men into battle. I've worked with people from all walks of life. And I've been in situations where the stakes were far higher than anything you could comprehend. I don't care about your rules, but I do care about my family, and if you don't stop harassing my wife and my daughter, I will make sure you regret it." Karen, now visibly shaken, tried to recover. I don't know what you're talking about." "This is about the rules, David. You can't just ignore them." David's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about rules anymore, Karen. This is about power. And I have the power to take you down." The room fell silent as the weight of David's words sank in. Karen, A woman who had long wielded her power over the neighborhood suddenly found herself on the receiving end of the same kind of force she had once used so easily. But this wasn't a fight she could win, not when she was up against a man. Like David, trained, methodical, and relentless. David stood, his gaze never leaving hers. "You have 24 hours to apologize to my family and retract your complaint. If you don't, I will make sure the HOA knows exactly who they've been allowing to run their organization." He turned and walked out, leaving Karen to contemplate the gravity of his words. She had no idea what was coming next. David's world had shifted dramatically in just 48 hours. What had started as a quiet suburban life, focused on his family's well-being, had now become a war of wills, a battle of power, pride, and the deep instinct to protect what mattered most. He wasn't about to let Karen, or anyone for that matter, destroy the fragile balance they had fought so hard to create for their daughter Emma. As soon as he left Karen's office that fateful morning, David knew that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself with a mere confrontation. It wasn't just about the life support machine anymore. No. Karen's actions had transcended into something far more sinister. The violation of his family's basic rights, and the overreach of someone who had far too much power in a place where it didn't belong. David had taken a step forward, and there was no turning back now. That night, after returning home to Sarah and Emma, David set his plan into motion. He knew that he would need more than just his own words to take Karen down. He needed allies, resources, and leverage. He wasn't just any man in this fight. He was a retired general with connections to the highest levels of military and government, and he was ready to wield those connections to dismantle Karen's campaign against his family. David called his old friend Tom, a former military lawyer with experience in legal battles that spanned far beyond what most civilians could fathom. Tom was now working in private practice, and David trusted him completely. After explaining the situation, David made it clear that this was no longer just an HOA issue. It was a fight for the dignity of his family, one that needed to be won at all costs. "I'll handle it, Dave," Tom said, his voice calm and steady. "We'll make sure this Karen knows who she's messing with. I'll get started on legal avenues, but I also think we can hit her where it hurts, her reputation." David hung up the phone with a sense of relief, knowing he wasn't alone in this battle. But it wasn't just legal muscle he needed. He needed the HOA to understand that they couldn't turn a blind eye to Karen's actions. He needed to make it clear that the HOA's rules weren't above basic human decency. They weren't above protecting a child's right to live. David's next step was to involve the media. Over the years, he had maintained a low profile, but through his military connections, he had built relationships with journalists and press agents who respected him and his work. It wasn't hard for David to get in touch with a few key reporters, who would be sympathetic to the story of a military general whose family was being harassed by a power-hungry HOA president. He knew that exposing the truth would add a layer of public pressure on Karen that she wouldn't be able to escape from. Within hours, the story was making its way through local news channels. The headline, "Retired General's Family Targeted by HOA President Over Life-Saving Equipment," ran on the front page of the local paper, accompanied by an interview with David. The piece didn't just focus on the violation of rules, it painted a picture of an aggressive, domineering woman who had crossed a line. The tone of the article was clear. The community was behind David, and Karen's reputation was starting to crack under the pressure. Karen, predictably, wasn't happy. She watched in growing fury as the media outlets picked up on the story. Her carefully curated image as the strong, no-nonsense leader of the HOA was being shredded piece by piece. She had been able to control the narrative for years, but now she was being painted as a villain, a person who didn't care about the well-being of a disabled child and had the audacity to use her position to enforce rules that had no place in such a sensitive matter. Karen's response was swift. She made a call to the HOA board, demanding that David's media campaign be stopped immediately. She argued that the media had gotten it all wrong and that she had simply been doing her duty to uphold the community's regulations. But her defense was weak, and it was clear that many on the board were starting to have second thoughts about her actions. In the days that followed, Karen became more erratic in her attempts to salvage her position. She attempted to meet with David to clear the air, but David refused. There was no negotiating with someone like Karen, someone who had already shown her true nature. She sent letters of apology, though they seemed insincere at best, hoping to patch things up with the community. She made phone calls to her allies within the HOA, begging them to support her and push for the removal of the media coverage. But David had already planted the seed of doubt, and it was growing. As the pressure mounted, Karen began to unravel. The once steely confidence she had in her ability to control the community's decisions was slipping away. She couldn't quite grasp the depth of the consequences of her actions. She had underestimated David. She had underestimated his connections, his intellect, and his unwavering commitment to his family. David wasn't just a military general in name. He was someone who knew how to navigate complex systems and how to make his voice heard. He had no intention of backing down, not while his daughter's health and safety were at risk. And every day, with each new piece of evidence David and his team uncovered, it became clearer that Karen had been abusing her power for far longer than anyone had known. One evening, as David was going over the final details of his legal strategy, with Tom, he received a phone call from the HOA board. They had called an emergency meeting and they wanted David there to discuss Karen's future with the association. "David," the voice on the other end said, "we need you to come to this meeting. The board has been receiving a lot of complaints about Karen's actions, and they're considering removing her from her position as president. We want your input." David didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." The next morning, he walked into the HOA's office building with the same steely resolve that had carried him through countless missions. The boardroom was filled with members of the HOA, each one looking nervous, unsure of what would happen next. At the far end of the room, Karen sat, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The air was thick with tension. David's entrance caused a stir as the members of the board stood to acknowledge him. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. David wasn't the man on the defensive anymore. He was the one who had brought the fight to them. And now, Karen was the one who was being scrutinized. The meeting started with the usual pleasantries, but it didn't take long for the discussion to turn to Karen's conduct. Several board members expressed their concerns, citing the media coverage, the growing public backlash, and most importantly, the welfare of the families within the community. Karen tried to defend herself, but her words were weak, her arguments falling flat. She couldn't deny the damage she had done to her own reputation, nor could she deny the damage she had caused to the trust of the very community she had sworn to protect. David stood and addressed the room. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of a man who had lived through far more significant challenges. "Karen, you've abused your power," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "You've put my daughter's life at risk, and for what? To uphold rules that should never have been enforced in the first place? I'm not asking for you to be removed, but I'm telling you this. If you stay in that seat, you will only bring more chaos to this community. It's time to step down." The room was silent, the board members all looking to one another, unsure of how to proceed. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that David's influence was undeniable. The board voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position as president. Karen's face turned red with humiliation as she realized that her reign of terror had come to an end. David's victory wasn't just personal. It was a victory for every family in the neighborhood who had been living under the thumb of an overzealous HOA president. And as he left the boardroom, he knew this was just the beginning. The fallout was far from over, but for now his family was safe, and justice had been served. The night after Karen's removal from the HOA board, David sat in the living room staring out the window at the quiet suburban street. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had dominated his life for the past few weeks. The phone calls, the media scrutiny, the constant tension. It had all taken its toll on his family. And yet, despite the storm that had raged, there was a sense of calm beginning to settle in the air. Sarah, still recovering from the emotional toll the ordeal had taken on her, sat beside him. She had always been the rock of the family, the one who kept everything together even when it felt like the world was falling apart. But even she had been shaken by the sheer audacity of Karen's actions. As Sarah leaned against David, he could feel the weight of everything they had endured. They had been forced to confront a woman who had put their child's life at risk, and now Karen's time in power was officially over. David's thoughts turned to Emma, who was asleep in her room, the steady hum of her life support machine filling the quiet. Emma's condition hadn't improved. Her world was still the same fragile balance of medications, treatments, and machines. But for the first time in weeks, David allowed himself to believe that they might finally be able to breathe a little easier. Karen was gone. The threat had been eliminated, and his family, though scarred by the events that had unfolded, was safe. But the feeling of relief was fleeting. David knew the road to healing wasn't going to be as simple as removing Karen from her position. The damage had been done, and the scars would take time to fade. Still, it wasn't the kind of pain that could break them. If anything, it had made them stronger, more resilient, more united than ever before. A knock on the door broke his reverie, and he glanced at Sarah before getting up to answer it. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the familiar faces of the HOA board members standing on his doorstep. It had been weeks since the confrontation, and David hadn't expected to see them again, not this soon at least. "General Harper," the lead board member, Frank, said as he shook David's hand, "we wanted to come by and personally apologize for the way things have unfolded. We've heard the news, and the board wanted to express their regret for allowing Karen to act the way she did." David was taken aback. The apology wasn't what he had expected, but it was clear that the HOA board had been shaken by the fallout from Karen's actions. The community had been divided, with many residents questioning the HOA's legitimacy and Karen's methods. Now, in the wake of her removal, the board was scrambling to rebuild their reputation and regain the trust of the people they served. "I appreciate the gesture," David said, his tone measured. "But this goes beyond just an apology. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. You have a responsibility to the families in this community, not just the rules." Frank nodded, his expression serious. "We know, and we're committed to doing better. We've already begun a review of the HOA's bylaws and guidelines. We want to ensure that something like this never happens again. We've also decided to implement more transparency in our decision-making processes." David could tell that Frank was sincere. The man's demeanor was respectful, and there was a humility in his voice that hadn't been there when Karen had been in charge. The board's apology was a start, but David knew that true change would take time. Still, he wasn't going to let this moment pass without holding them accountable. "I want to make sure that this community understands the severity of what Karen did," David said. "I want to ensure that the HOA operates with more oversight and that the power doesn't rest in the hands of one person who can abuse it. I don't want to see any other family go through what we did." Frank agreed, and they spent the next half hour discussing the steps the board would take to reform the HOA and ensure that something like this would never happen again. It wasn't a quick fix, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. By the end of the meeting, David felt a sense of cautious optimism. They weren't just addressing the symptoms of the problem, they were taking responsibility for the culture that had allowed Karen to gain so much control in the first place. After the board members left, David returned to the living room where Sarah was waiting. He could see the relief on her face, but there was still a hint of weariness in her eyes. The events of the past few weeks had left their mark, and though they had won the battle, the emotional toll of the fight was still fresh. "Do you think things will change now?" Sarah asked, her voice soft. David sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "I hope so. I think they will. It's not going to be perfect, but it's a start. We'll make sure that Karen's actions are never forgotten, that what she did doesn't fade into the past." Sarah nodded, but she still looked uncertain. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what she did to Emma. I don't know if we'll ever be able to forget the fear we felt." David squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her words. He understood. The fear that had gripped them, the uncertainty that had come with Karen's threats. It wasn't something that could just be erased, but he also knew that they had fought for something important. They had stood up, not just for Emma, but for every family in their community who had ever been silenced by someone in power. They had won, not because they had the strongest argument, but because they had the courage to stand their ground. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal. The media coverage of the HOA's actions died down, but the impact lingered. More residents became involved in the governance of the HOA, pushing for greater accountability and transparency. Karen's reputation, once built on a foundation of fear and control, was shattered. No longer did she hold sway over the people she had so ruthlessly tried to dominate. But even as the neighborhood moved forward, there was a quiet understanding that the scars of the past would remain. Emma's condition had not changed. She was still the same sweet girl who had captured their hearts, but the fear of losing her still lingered, the fragility of her life a constant reminder of the stakes. David found peace in knowing that they had done everything they could to protect her. And in time, the community began to rebuild, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that allowed the people within it to stand up for each other, to speak out when something was wrong, and to support one another in times of need. As for Karen, she disappeared from the public eye. No longer a fixture of the neighborhood, she moved away, leaving behind a trail of broken relationships and tarnished reputations. But her downfall served as a powerful reminder to the people in the community of the importance of standing up to injustice, no matter how powerful the opposition seemed. David and Sarah stood side by side, watching Emma play in the backyard, her laughter ringing through the air. It was a moment of peace, a moment they had fought for, a moment they could finally enjoy without fear. Though the scars of the past would never fully disappear, they knew that they had come through stronger, united in their love for each other and for their daughter. In the end, it wasn't just about winning the battle against Karen. It was about finding the courage to stand up for what was right, to protect the ones you love, and to ensure that no one could ever threaten your family again. And that was a victory worth celebrating. Stay tuned and subscribe to the HOA stories for more real life. Tales of community drama and how justice prevails.